A warm welcome to one and all, those who have joined in and all those who would soon be with us. This is the 12th webinar from the series of 30 webinars INHAF is organizing with many of its partners. I'm here to present the rationale behind the series of webinars. The webinar series is an integral part of C2T, Citizens Urban Initiative, launched last year. The initiative is a multi-level and a multidisciplinary societal effort of India's leading urban and related professionals, development thinkers and practitioners to work on a blueprint that outlines the country's response to the complex urban challenge in an attempt to ensure productive, inclusive, sustainable, livable and humane cities for equitable, harmonious, and fun-filled happy societies. The broad objectives are reassessing India's urban challenge, rethinking Indian cities, and reformulating responses in the context of national development challenges. I can say we have just begun. We are all aware of the harsh facts that India's urban system has been faltering and our cities are not at all in good shape or good health. The pandemic has made it all the more obvious. In more ways than one, be it the economy or the environment, the slums or the sustainability issue, be it resources or governance, it is seemingly endless list. The pandemic is not here to stay. With the fast pace of science and technology, we would tide over it soon with someone to come up with developments in vaccination. It is going forward beyond the COVID crisis. The Indian economy has to look beyond. And it is all the more strategic to reassess, rethink, and rework for a better future. The webinars, those already done and those in the offing, have been and are going to be definitely an eye-opener. The whole idea revolves around the much needed societal dialogue on how we handle urbanization, the processes, and to develop cities. How cities need to remain engines of economic growth, minus the exploitative instinct, elements, and systems that impact people, environment, and economy adversely. Though the pandemic put into sharp focus the migrants, the homelessness, the imminent joblessness, and the search for livelihood sooner or later, it is the informal economy, large and growing, more eminent in cities, needs to a makeover. Then there are the slums and the slum dwellers, maybe the poor and the living conditions, ill health and starvation, misery and helplessness. Further on, the stress on cities when it comes to housing or transport or drinking water, sanitation, and so on. The climate change is also another crisis knocking at the door. With all these things, cities will need to be rethought and reorganized. Changing all of this is no small challenge. Even while the pandemic shock leaves us with what they all say, a new normal, there is a need for a fresh perspective and a strong resolve on our part to pursue the change. The pandemic has provided us the much needed opportunity, coming together on a common platform, which otherwise is often difficult. I'm talking of this virtual platform. This platform brings us together for this sharing and discussion. This is the platform to get into a reflective frame of mind, even though for a brief period, to invest our time and energy in this borderless interface and to be receptive to thoughts, not just from the intelligentsia, but the commoner as well. We have taken it upon us to make the best of this opportunity and make the most out of it. It is this logic behind the 30 webinars that we are working on. It is to put together and deal with the complexity of the subject adequately and from all angles. Not taking much time, I come to today's theme: city and risk, achievements and opportunities. May I now request Mihir Bhatt to take over, who is the anchor for today's webinar. Thank you. Vatsa, all over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Madan. Thank you so much for introducing the rethinking part and the urban part. And I think from rethinking that you said cities, we have to go to reacting, redoing things. And we have a galaxy here, panelists, all of them have been reacting, redoing things so that we are able to improve the city and risk goals. I'm Mihir Bhatt, and to give you the background to the audience and participants here, this is a 12th webinar that INHAF is doing. And we as the Duryog Nivaran were doing series of seminars on disasters and risk, and one on governance in Colombo, and then the next one was in Dhaka on women and risk, and this one here, the third one, is the city and risk. So it's a confluence, what in Hindi we call Sangam, of two different webinar series is meeting together, and wherever there is a Sangam, it's quite auspicious. So we hope this is very auspicious as well, I'm quite sure. And I thank INHAF for that, with which I have a very long connection. In fact, when it was founded, I was very much there, and Kirtibai invited me to be one of the initial people there. And of course, I work with All India Disaster Mitigation Institute and Duryog Nivaran, which is again a South Asia network, and was founded there, and I was invited to be there. As the plan moved ahead, it became quite clear that there were a lot of other people who had great interest in what we were doing. And I thought it would be wonderful to bring them in. And first and most important person, of course, was with Krishna ji, who is here. And India's response to not only COVID, but disaster risk is tremendous, especially in urban areas for a long time. And we thought it would be very useful, both of us, that we think together, talk about things together. So I have Krishna Vatsa here, and he's the member of National Disaster Management Authority. I'll introduce people as they speak, but just to give you the idea about who else is with us. We also wanted to look this from the educational point of view and from the point of view of the whole urban resilience point. And Liz Elizabeth is here, Herman, and we'll be looking at that. We have Monica, who's here, architect and designer, and inspiration to many of us, and just gets things going. And she's looked at both the cities very clearly in terms of development, but development which is resilient and sustainable. So that's what we have. And we have Bijay Kumar here, who's been an old, long-standing friend with Global Network for Disaster Risk Reduction. And he runs one of the largest civil society organization network, and he'll bring in that perspective to us. We have Achyut from Nepal, Kathmandu, and he's been working with the practical action for a long time, and how small acts of risk reduction are so important. And that's something he's going to underline for us. And we also have here Taher, whom we can't see, but his presence will feel very soon. And he is from Dhaka, and he's worked a lot both in the region as well as in Bangladesh on risk reduction for more than 20 years. And of course, we have Nayana, who is from Colombo and has a long distinguished career in the private sector, chairing the Housing Board and Asian Development Bank, Nayana. And we also have him work with the private sector now, and very important Colombo force, both in terms of building and construction, but also risk reduction. So that's the group we have. As you see from in my opening remarks, obviously I have 2 or 3 points to point out, before which I will hand over to Krishna Vatsa, a member of National Disaster Management Authority. And when we were discussing this particular risk and city related challenges, we found 2 things very important to look at. And one was that achievements that are made. And there are 3 or 4 areas where achievements are made. And that included, for example, awareness raising. And we found that fair amount of urban areas and urban authorities have become aware of the risks that they face, and a fair amount of advancement is done there. We were looking at, again, another area is about the governance. And there are examples of how cities have set up, budgets, cities have set up focal points, small units for risk response, etc., all across the region. In India particularly, partly thanks to UNDRR's program of cities and risk that they have run a whole campaign for a long time. And roughly 22 cities we looked at, and one saw the physical evidence of that in the region and in the country as well. So there has been an achievement and a movement there. There is also achievement in movement further in terms of investment. And there is more investment coming into the urban risk reduction sector. We are in Ahmedabad, and believe it or not, the municipal corporation has put its own money from its own budget to spend on heat wave action plan, for example, which hasn't had before, or now is putting in this year money for the clean air program. A different kind of risk, but that is happening. And there's a long list of such cities, not long enough by any stretch of imagination, but that is happening. And the 4th area where there is fair amount of work has been done and some achievements are made, and that is related to protection and preparedness. And by protection, one is rather, after COVID, a bit sobered about that, in the sense that to be able to protect the citizens who live within the city, and there's a health, there is education, there is finance, electricity and power for that matter. But in COVID, we saw that the cities were actually not able to protect a large number of whatever you call them. I would call them citizens, but migrant labor, I don't know why they were called migrant, or for that matter, informal sector. And in fact, they are the formal and all of us are informal. If you look at the percentage in terms of number, and if you look at the economic contribution that they make vis-a-vis what we make per head. So cities were rather small-hearted, if I may say so without not being too harsh. And they couldn't think of the citizens who were living with them. There are hardly any example, perhaps Kerala would have some, where cities said to the migrants, the laborers, citizens themselves, that look, don't go away, we are here, this is your city, stay and we'll give you water to wash hands and drink and food and shelter, and we'll also protect you from the health crisis that we have. And sadly, that doesn't happen. And that brings me to the last point, is that that's the reason why I need to rethink about city and risk again. That what the idea of a city that we thought we have in terms of a place of culture, place of trade and commerce, place of new ideas, economic engine, and all those ideas are failing. In fact, currently, the GDP of many of the countries in the region are running into negative. And if you look at the urban economic growth, it's even worse. And 2021, next year, the predictions are that it's going to be even worse than that. And cities will not be the engines of recovery. In fact, it will be the rural population which will be pushing the economy further. And cities will be riding on the back of rural population to come out of the economic crisis. So the whole idea about city, why it is so wonderful, are failing. And so is the failure of the economic structures that we have. So in that kind of a situation, this particular city and risk webinar that we have has become very important to hold. And let us discuss first in parts in terms of the achievements, and the panelists, for a few, would share their ideas and your work, which are based on your own work, in terms of what the achievements are as far as sitting and risk is concerned. And in the second part, we will have the opportunities, and in which would be later on commented by Achyut, Luitel from Nepal, Kathmandu. The first part will be commented on by Taher from Dhaka. And in the end, and after that, we have question answers, as you know. And please, you can send your questions now. You don't have to wait for anything. And after the question answers, we are very lucky to have Animesh Kumar from UNDRR, which has run, as we know, for years, the largest and most prominent campaign on urban resilience. And he's going to help us put all this together so that we can actually do something about it, from rethinking to reacting, actually doing something or doing things differently, if you will. So that's the flow we have. To start with, Krishna Vatsa from National Disaster Management Authority is going to ask, is going to start with the achievements and how he sees the possible opportunities ahead. And Krishna Vatsa, like most of the, all of the panelists here now, is a good friend, but more importantly, he's worked effortlessly, 1:32 at night, which is the usual standard time when you see him still working, and he's finishing either National Human Resource Development Strategy for India, or he's just finishing Asia Pacific risk analysis indicators, and year in and year out, he's been after every major initiative that UN system has taken as far as risk reduction is concerned. He's very quiet and he doesn't like focus. I'm glad he's joined us here. But we have a lot to have from him. Currently, he's a member of the National Disaster Management Authority. Krishna Vatsa, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me now clearly?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so thanks again for inviting me to this webinar, and it's a great honor to share this virtual panel with distinguished panelists and scholars. I would like to start with the established wisdom about the development, which was that if you want to develop, you have to transition from rural to urban. And if you have to develop, then you have to transition from agriculture to manufacturing or service sectors. The value addition happens in urban centers, and the centers in the cities are the centers of wealth and creativity and ingenuity. So urbanization emerged as a sure and unequivocal indicator of development. More urbanized the country, the more developed it is. And there were very valid reasons for that, because people had access to civic infrastructure. People looked for jobs and found jobs and improved their quality of life. And also they had better access to social amenities like schools and colleges, and they had much greater cultural space for sharing their creativity. So on all accounts, cities were the preferred destinations, and we saw humanity march to cities in droves. Millions and millions of people joined the cities, and I am one of them, who moved from a very distinct rural background to the cities in course of looking for good life. So being urban, urban is an adjective, Mihir bhai, if I want to, refer to an elegant person like you, I would say Mihir bhai is such an urbane person, So, it is definitely, a positive adjective, but suddenly the world has appended, and being rural and being remote is good, and being urban and the sense of sharing the space, the human connection, not so good these days, really the world has really gone an upside down in the matter of 5-6 months. And the driver has been the pandemic, Now what happened, and I would just look at what happened in India, the density of the population and the spread of virus are so closely related. Wherever we had much greater concentration of population, the caseload was much higher. It was in proportion to that. So, and it's not just limited to India. I think across the world it has been the case. A very high number of deaths in New York could be explained only by the density of population there. But in India, there are 4 unmistakable trends. One, that the urban estates were far more affected than the rural estates. Even today, if you look at 10 big cities, they have the more than 50% of the caseload. So cities definitely are the concentration of the pandemic cases. But the second important thing was that within the cities who were affected, and definitely those people who lived in slums, those who lived in low-income colonies and settlements, they were much more affected than the people living in more spread out areas, more planned areas. So that explained a very high caseload in Dharavi. That explains a very high caseload in eastern Delhi. And this story has been repeated in the city after city. Slums really became the center of the spread of pandemic. The third, I think, important trend was in relation to deaths. I think maximum number of deaths have taken place in the cities, of those who died of pandemic. And also, largely because, the people who lived in the cities, people who were in a higher age group, they had a higher incidence of comorbidity. And they also had problems in accessing health facilities at a time when the health system was overloaded. So this led to a large number of deaths in the cities. And the fourth trend, that also, if you look at it carefully, it's very clear that even among the urban states, those where the urban development was more skewed, they suffered more compared to those states where the urban spread was more even. Now, for example, Maharashtra has suffered very heavily, and say Telangana or even Ahmedabad, these states have a Kerala or Punjab or Haryana, where or even Andhra Pradesh, the newly carved out Andhra Pradesh, where the urbanization is far more. We see that the pattern of urbanization also has a clear impact on the way the pandemic has spread out in the country. there was that due to the lockdown and all the restrictive measures that were taken, we also had loss of livelihoods, and we have the informal workers, in a situation where they could not access their livelihoods, they had no income, and we had this huge march across the roads to reach their destinations. And I think this provided a sense of urgency, and this really raised the issue of huge inequality that characterized the urban life. All these people were actually the source of cheap labor. They actually sustained the city economy, and they provided the competitive edge to the service and manufacturing sector, largely because of the low wages that they received. And suddenly they were on move, huge drama, and it stirred almost everyone. It touched a chord in everyone, and I think that's really along with the pandemic, this mass spectacle of the inequality marching on the road really brought into the question the kind of development that these cities represent. And I think as we tide over the crisis, this would be a real challenge to address. Development trends, of course, oscillate, and we move from one end to the other. But at some point, there will be some balancing, and there will be some long-term review of the development alternatives that exist before us. As we go ahead, what I look at and what are the possible trends that are likely to emerge. One, we are going to see a lot of digital innovation, and that would perhaps have some impact on the concentration of the need for people to live together. We are already participating in that digital innovation through this webinar. The second, I definitely see the MSMEs also emerging much stronger. We would see a much greater emphasis on strengthening the supply chain. We would also see a dispersal of these social, the educational and health institutions across the country. You would see more and more colleges, technical institutions, and hospitals being set up in third-tier cities and in the rural areas. So I also see that already the growth of the metro cities is slowing down, and these second-tier cities are emerging. But now we would see third-tier cities growing very fast. So we would see more dispersed urbanization. And the reforms in agriculture sector that are coming about around, I think that would also monetize the rural world, bring more entrepreneurs to the rural areas. And I think that would also bring in more civic amenities to the rural areas. And already in flagship programs like Swachh Bharat, bringing some of these amenities to the rural areas. But I see a much greater potential for an intervention like Pura. I don't know if you've heard of that. Pura was an initiative started by our former president, Abul Kalam, provision of urban amenities in rural areas. And now it has been scaled up through this urban mission. So I would see a much greater emphasis on transforming the rural areas through the provision of these civic amenities, through setting production hubs, through setting up more markets, and bringing the producers together. I think there would be many more changes. The important thing is this, how these changes are being negotiated. When we are in flux, there are always changes, but they need to be mediated properly. We had previous experience with Mumbai changed radically after 1897 plague. It expanded and it changed especially with more wider roads, more open spaces, with sea breeze passing through the settlements. But at that time, this refashioning of Mumbai was highly contested. It created a lot of fault lines between the British, who were controlling Mumbai, and the Parsis, who were the dominant force, and the remaining population of Mumbai. So it's the change is never easy, and it's very, very important for the government to mediate this change in a good way. So I definitely see a lot of change coming in the wake of the pandemic. It's very important that some of the initiatives, as I mentioned, get a greater emphasis and greater attention. And the last point that I would like to make, and very important for India, that if India has to achieve some balanced development, it is time to give greater attention to states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, who have become kind of, internal colonies of cheap labor. They only provide cheap labor to the industrialized, urbanized states. And this is something that needs to be addressed through provision of more opportunities and more amenities in all the states. So this is how I see the pandemic panning out in India, and probably the world. It will be a different place. We won't have metro cities, big urban agglomerations. We will have smaller cities, but this transition may not be so easy, and it would largely depend upon the kind of policies that the government would pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishna ji. Thank you so much for your introductory overview of where we are going, and you suggest a whole range of shifts from example urban industry to rural industry, urban agriculture. You mentioned from jobs to livelihoods. You mentioned move from large cities to what do we do with the cheap labor in urban, and in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and also from very much sort of central to spread of health and education and other basic amenities in the rural area, sort of disperse urban services. And the most important to me was SME that you mentioned. So thank you very much for your opening remarks. And we'll go to the panel now, and we'll request first Bijay Kumar, and the sequence is Bijay Kumar, then Elizabeth, then Monica, and Nayana. And Bijay Kumar, if you could go first. He heads the CEO of a global network of civil society organizations, very large cloud across the globe, and direct access to the front line where the risks are being reduced. And Bijay Kumar, we'll start with your presentation. We'll stick to time as, we all have limitations on that. So Bijay Kumar, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Mihir bhai. It's really a pleasure and quite an humbling experience for me to be among the panels, and I'm seeing Krishnaji after long years, but I have my friends like Animesh, Mihir, and Achyut bhai also. I'm seeing him after a long time, but also new friends. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. As Mihir said, I represent Global Network of Civil Society Organization for Disaster Reduction. It is a network of almost 1,400 organizations who are from 126 countries. So what I'll try to do, I actually look at it from the urban risk management, and what are some of the achievements that perhaps I would have claimed before the COVID-19 started. So let's say we started globally, we recognized that the urbanization itself is a way forward for us, is the new ways of living in the world. In our attempt to change ourselves, the urbanization is the new way to live. And we actually also increase our understanding about the risk associated with the urbanization process. We post new urban agenda, we came up with a host of policy framework, thanks to many attempts, including UNDRR, that I closely associate myself with. There's quite a bit of attempt by UN Habitat and others, so to ensure that each and every country come up with a policy framework for the urban governance. And that is where the governance comes, which has been talked of. We have set up governance systems in the urban areas. We have set up the budgeting. We have set up the planning in most of the countries where urban governance has been set up. It is quite active now. And as has been said already, there has been quite a bit of investment. We go anywhere in the world, in the urban areas, we have better roads, better infrastructure, better houses, better energy distribution, better water access. So this is what we are actually experiencing today. But now the biggest question is, now where we are the post COVID-19 or during the COVID-19. The COVID-19, as I see, it exposed the underlying problems that we have in our society. The first is that definitely it exposed the inequality that exists in our society. The current economic model has only perpetuated producing inequality in the society. I live in London. I can see that even within UK, one of the developed countries, you can see that the people who were Black, Asian, minority, and ethnic groups, they were most hit because there is an inequality that they have been part of. And we do see that everywhere across the globe, where the people who were poorer, who are unequal, they actually experienced the impact of COVID in the most significant way. And we actually saw the politics of populism. And I still remember when the COVID was hitting Italy already, British system was saying, no, it might not hit us. Indian system said, no, Indians are always immune. So we can actually survive this. It's not going to impact us. Our immunity is much higher. So we were actually, there's a politics of populism that was actually happening all over the world in their respective times. And there's a limitations that we actually promoted a national boundary, which is dysfunctional when we are talking of pandemic. We are a global village. Anything that happened in China is so that the way it spread to other parts of the world, and we can't afford to have the limitation of nation as a boundary. And we can't have, because pandemic doesn't stop. It doesn't stop with a boundary and doesn't need a visa or doesn't need a passport to go to the other country. So like say, that is what we actually realized. And we also saw, which has been very clearly articulated by Krishnaji and also Achyut, I also referred to by Mihir, we actually saw a least caring and non-inclusive cities. We got the cities is primarily using the labor force, cheap labor force from the areas. Like say India is a typical example where you saw millions of migrant laborers on the street. And suddenly we saw the city doesn't have a heart. It actually uses this cheap labor, but doesn't include them, neither in the planning nor in any of the response that was actually talked about. We also saw that while government was investing on flying people in from the various countries, but couldn't manage to invest to actually take people by trains. It took so many days before actually government actually could actually manage to invest this. So that is not the experience only in one country, that was the experience all over the world. And throughout we saw that risk is not integrated into investment and planning. So we saw that now when I see what is happening in Maharashtra or what's happening in Indian cities, when there is a rain, then the roads are flooded, there is no transportation system which is working, there is no facility which is actually ensuring that the investment that when we actually constructed those facilities were taking into account the risk that these facilities could be actually exposed to. Now, and one more thing that I just thought, that actually all society approach was significantly absent. So it was almost like while the civil society organizations, the communities, its own structure was responding the best, but the government didn't actually quite closely work with the civil society across the globe. I'm not talking of any specific country. I'm talking of global experience that I see across, and that we see from the various members that we actually hear from. So I'll actually stop here before we go to the next part. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
So thank you so much, Bijay Kumar. And we'll come back to you. You have several questions, but we are keeping the questions later on. We'll come back to you. And now we have Elizabeth Dean Herman. She's a professor. She was just the head of the Department of Architecture in Rhode Island School of Design, one of the best design schools worldwide. And she has this amazing interest in cities, both in the US, such as Rhode Island, such as Providence, for example, and cities in South Asia, which includes in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, of course, India. So she has the dual view of cities from both sides, and she does it very well. And she does it both with us, but she does that with young students I've seen. And sometimes one wonder who is younger in mind, her or her students, in terms of coming up with new ideas and new ways of looking at what's ahead of us. Elizabeth, if I may request you to please make your presentation in 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello, Elizabeth? We can't hear you. Elizabeth, we can't hear you.
Yes, I'm not on mute.
Okay, now we can hear you. Excellent.
You can, okay, okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So just to correct one thing, Mihir, I've never been head of architecture. I was actually head of the faculty recently.
Sorry, faculty research.
For the whole school. No,
that's what I meant. I'm sorry.
I appreciate the elevation. Anyway, I just want to very quickly go over some of the work that we've been doing in South Asia over the years in terms of what the accomplishments at this end have been to date. And I want to frame that by saying my own background is in biomedical research and tropical medicine, focusing on marginalized communities. My design degrees were in various scales, from landscape to architecture to urban, And then my later higher degree was actually looking at pandemic disease in the pre-modern Muslim world. So the current moment is particularly interesting to me. I'm just going to go quickly through these images. We know the problems that cities are facing now. They're facing them all over the world. And what I've been curious about is how so many countries are looking to high technology solutions until more recently. And yet I've been working in South Asia for 25 years and keep saying, but people there actually have the answers. They may not be implementing them at the scale to be effective, but it's high-tech solutions are not going to be the way forward. So like the other speakers here, I believe that cities are only as resilient as their most vulnerable citizens, and that's a big part of our work. So again, very quickly, what we look at when we're looking at cities of South Asia or the cities of America or South America, where we've also worked, is really looking at this idea of a networked city on multiple scales where the environment, the social structures, the various groups within society, governance and activism at the lowest levels are all integrated into the thinking. And that each of these together, the bottom-up efforts, the top-down efforts, are what give form to our society, to our city, and to our ability to be resilient. So this is what we call mesh urbanism, and it's really looking at taking systems that have formerly worked at the scale of a whole city and redefining these as broken up, scattered centers of integrated systems that are under the control of local communities. We go through a process with my students in classes where we also deal with these, where the students are constantly modeling those systems. They model them in 2 dimensions, they model them in 3 dimensions, and when they actually come to designing the city, I have them work with unfamiliar materials so that, again, they begin to think of everything in its performative aspect and its integrated aspect. So this is a social ecological approach. Social equity is a huge part of it. I realize I need to go quite quickly. So our work starting 25 years ago was in Bangladesh, where we held a conference there on how, in order to rethink a city or to build a new city, you really needed to start with the natural infrastructure. We were looking at water flows, again, how we can begin to divide these systems up through the city, the management of them, how they're integrated with other systems. More recently, my students have started working with things like the material flow from the garment industry, the waste from that, how that can be used for the resources that are lacking in a country like Bangladesh. So there she was looking at garment waste being turned into construction material. Another student was looking at Dhaka in terms of cracking. He literally used the metaphor of cracking open the city and beginning to let the spaces that bring people together and the resources that bring people together be the defining factor. We've also worked in Kolkata. This was work with Monica, where we are again looking at the urban waste cycle and trying to understand how that can happen at a smaller grain. So we were using Kaligat as our location, again focusing on how any development should be remediating soil, city, lives, economy, etc. So I'm just going to slip through that. And then more recently, we've been in Sri Lanka, where we were invited in after the end of the war to begin to focus on the northern and the eastern post-conflict zones. And we've been looking at urban redevelopment. We've been looking at resettlement of people who've been displaced. We've looked at urban growth trends, so urbanization through displacement. And then again, I've actually been involved in specific design projects that are often placed on land that is inappropriate, and trying to educate the people there as to the the issues that they need to be addressing in terms of this. So this is the final slide, and I'll end here. We can come back to this later. Can't hear you, Mihir. You're on mute.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for the succinct presentation and also overview of what all can be done and is going on already. Let's move to Monica Bhargava. And Monica is architect, designer, artist, I recently discovered, doing her shows, and also a good friend now to think about urban design differently and how urban design, if done with care, can reduce risk and actually build resilience, whatever you end up doing it. Monica, yes, you, please. And 5 minutes, we are running behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir. So let me share my screen. Yeah, so I'm just bringing down the whole scale of this discussion which has been happening. I'm going to be sharing my experience in working with Park Street, Kolkata. And just as we are discussing today, rethinking cities and risk, way back in 2007, we were discussing the same at the Center for Built Environment. And the older parts of Kolkata were getting into a state of decay, and there seemed just no government intervention or public will to renew or repair the existing city fabric, just as Krishna said, mediating change in a good way. And so we asked that where was the private will? And we thought, let's do something. Let's gather people's support to initiate a pilot project of rejuvenating Park Street, which was Kolkata's fine dining and entertainment hub. So with the development of the Salt Lake Township in the 70s, Park Street had been reduced to a thoroughfare linking the East End with Chaurangi and the Bibidi-Bagh business district. And this had posed serious threats on the street of clogging, pollution, parking, degeneration. And we needed Park Street to be understood as a prestigious destination and not just a transportation bypass road. So 18th December 2007, we organized a Kolkata colloquium at the Oxford bookstore, and more than 100 stakeholders, including restaurateurs, shop owners, residents, bureaucrats, municipal, police officials, architects, teachers, students, social activists, media personnel, they all turned up, and many issues were discussed, like the issues which Park Street was suffering from, of traffic, of the metro, of restoration, sensitive reuse, of the risk and the resilience, of ideas to mobilize the side streets, use the courtyards, create a larger entity, a Park Street district as a kind of an action plan. And such enthusiasm, such public enthusiasm was generated for this project that in July 2008, the Society for Park Street Rejuvenation Kolkata, better known as SPARK, which I represent, was created. And we understood that implementing a grand urban design vision is a long-term multi-decision task. And a step in this direction, we thought, could be to design a festival to get the people back on the street, at the same time showcasing to the stakeholders and the government bodies the gains that rejuvenation brings. And Park Street, being a colonial street, celebrates Christmas and New Year. We planned for a December carnival, but despite support from West Bengal tourism, the permissions could only be obtained for the first week of January 2009. And such was the success of this endeavor that before the end of it, permissions for a December carnival in the same year were discussed. Schools, stakeholders, citizens, they started joining SPARK for cleanup drives and we could actually start the rejuvenation work as a build-up to this carnival. We had zeroed in on Allen Park as the sole park on Park Street as the venue for this festival. So with the help of the Agri-Horticulture Society and a guideline by my friend Elizabeth Herman, who's here on the panel today, we renovated Allen Park. Elizabeth, you would be happy to know the resident community joined in the venture, monitoring the laying of the pathways for the morning, evening walkers, the play areas for the children, the public toilet, and till date, even during this pandemic, they actively participate in the use and maintenance of this park along with KMC. And it is this park that became the epicenter of support to the community in 2010, when the horrific fire engulfed Stephen Court. So its transformation of this park from a neglected, rumored peddler's den to the throbbing heart of a vibrant neighborhood has been a major achievement in this rejuvenation drive. And by 2013, the festival, which had started as a tiny spark, had become a blast. It was the most successful street festival and Christmas festival in the countries. But the opportunities which it created in building resilience and in rebranding Park Street is what I would like to come back later to. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And thank you so much to look at the Park Street and how you've dealt with that. And we will come back to also what opportunities that this particular approach to urban design offers. And let's go quickly to Nayana, Mawilmada. And if you would tell us from Colombo, your both work and experience on how does one deal with cities, the private sector and public sector, and both of them working together, not working together, and when they do work together, what kind of results that we can achieve. Thank you, Nayana.
Thank you, Mihir, and thank you for the team, to the team for having me on. I'll share just a very, very brief couple of thoughts, and maybe we can pick up some things in the Q&A. But you know, from where I sit in Colombo, and at the moment I sit in a private sector seat. Before that, I actually was heading one of the urban authorities here. You know, the big question that I started to ponder and my team started to ponder when the pandemic kind of broke out was, look, is this pandemic going to fundamentally change our city? And I look at the context of Colombo specifically most of the time. So I will speak mostly from that context. And of course, relative to India, Colombo is a tiny city, about 1 million people in population and about another million in the immediate fringe. So will we see a fundamental shift in the way the city is evolving? Will everybody start moving to the suburbs? Is this really, really going to happen? Are people truly going to start working from home and stay working from home? That's another kind of big question. Does this pandemic spell the end of urban space as we know it? And will our city, while it's not anywhere near as dense as the major cities in India, will it start to de-densify, and will the fundamental fabric change? So in other words, do we kind of throw out the playbook and say, look, this is all going to be different soon. Let's completely plan for a different future. And the more we think about this and the more we observe this, my view personally is, no, things are not going to fundamentally change that dramatically. I think the pendulum has swung. My sense is the pendulum will start to swing back. But it will take time, and it will be a function of how badly this pandemic affects an individual city. So Colombo and Sri Lanka is an anomaly. We've only had on about 2,000 cases so far, very, very minimal deaths, under 20 deaths. But we've been very, very lucky, and that was partly as the result of a very dramatic lockdown. We were completely locked down under police curfew for about 2.5 to 3 months. The entire city, entire country effectively shut down. And then we managed to get out of it without much community spread. There were a couple of outbreaks, but not too much. And it's been interesting to watch how people have got back to business. And I think in there lie a few nuggets of kind of trying to understand how people coped. So one piece of it was, okay, how have people coped in different types of residencies? And I have, Colombo is a city where, less than 10% of the population lives in multifamily housing. It's a bit unique in that respect. Of course, the capital city, Colombo, has about, I'd say over 35 to 40% living in, underserved-ish settlements, depending on how you classify them. And we did a bit of primary research actually in the middle income space to understand how did people cope in multifamily housing versus single family housing. And it's a bit interesting. What we found is the folks that lived in the multifamily housing reported being kind of better supplied. One of the big things that broke down with the instant shutdown of the country was the supply chains. How people got their food, how people got their pharmaceuticals, how people got various needs, and these supply chains completely shut down. And two things started to happen. In the smaller communities, you started to see communal suppliers really blossom out, reach out on WhatsApp and other modes, and all of a sudden, like, your village grocer became a big deal, and the big chains just kind of weren't able to deliver. But then within a matter of weeks, supply chains adapted, and the big players really did start to innovate and start to go in. But what you also saw at a retail level is where businesses provided a good or a service, they gravitated towards the higher density communities because they were economical to service. So the denser settlements, the denser parts of town actually ended up getting provided for slightly better. So it's interesting to see how that kind of evolved. The second thing which we started to look at was this whole thing of work from home. It's very cliche, everybody loves to do it. Most of us are doing some of our work from home. But the question is, are we getting the same level of productivity and is it sustainable? Again, there is no clear answer. It really, really depends. But what we do find is in some areas, you do get kind of greater efficiencies because you have kind of thinking time, less distraction. But particularly on the younger swathes of the population, the ones that are kind of new to jobs, new to corporate culture, the kind of interaction you get in terms of mentoring and growth don't seem to be there. And we see a lot of the younger folks, at least in the corporate space, vying to come back to work, actually, looking for that social interaction, looking for that mentorship and so on. And that's the kind of clear thing that you see in the corporate space, at least in Sri Lanka. The other one is, how will urban space change? Will we all of a sudden abandon our parks and prefer to sit in our balconies? And again, it's interesting, over the last few weeks, we've almost reverted completely back. It's bizarre that we've just, of course, more people wear masks now, but this urge to be communal as a human is an overriding impulse, I believe. And so again, as cases start to taper off and the fear of the pandemic starts to taper off, we're reverting back to the center. So overall, I think my observation, and this is my personal view, is the pandemic, it's tragic, absolutely, but it will probably pass, and it will take maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. I'm not really sure how long it will take, but the chances of it fundamentally altering urban patterns, I don't think so. Will it start to change a few things? Absolutely, yes. And I think it will start to accelerate innovations and moves that were already happening. For example, technology adoption will scale up naturally. Online retail and so on will kind of ramp up naturally. Some liberalization of working hours, yes, it will happen naturally. Will everybody sit at home and work for the rest of their lives? Absolutely not. Will we all move to the suburbs and live happily ever after? Absolutely not. I think we will still go back to the fundamental social, psychological force driving people to congregate in cities, and I think that's going to stay. And the issue of responding to this from a policy perspective, or from where I sit, from my kind of development perspective, is, you know, your development cycles are 4, 5, 6 years at a minimum. On a city scale, you're talking, you know, decade and a half horizons. So to react at the peak of a pandemic and try to design a city at the peak of a pandemic will not really be effective, because things will taper off and some things will just be like, okay, do we plan everything for 100-year flood kind of thing? So there's going to be a calculated risk element that everybody will have to take. So again, I'm more on the side of, look, impacts are going to be somewhat moderate. It'll have a peak and then it'll taper off as soon as we get hopefully some kind of vaccine or treatment. And then, you know, I think human society will start to revert back and concede to the forces that made cities in the first place. That's my view. Yeah.
Thank you, Nayan. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nayan, for this sobering and different point of view that things will pass. And we shouldn't plan when we are at a peak of something. We should see where we are going. And the question is, should we, should things be normal, or should they continue to change the direction that is possible? The panelists, the first round is finished in terms of achievements, and thank you very much for all the panel members. We have Taher Muhammad from Dhaka, who's going to lead some discussion. And we have received a lot of questions, and I have tried to allocate them as the participants have wanted to various panel members here already. And you may not be able to address all of them, but at least the ones that you already have, you can address in the next round, please. And to the participants, please continue sending your questions. Very interesting. And as they come, we are allocating, so we'll save some time on that. Radhika, if Mohammed Taher would be now giving his comments, he's tuned in. Radhika?
He's here, sir. Taher, sir,
Okay.
please start speaking.
So, Taher, sir, if you would speak and tell us, we can't see you though. And I know that's because of connectivity. Thank you.
Please unmute yourself.
Hello? I can't hear Taher Muhammad. Radhika?
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go on.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, you will have to live up to this because for some reason I can't be seen on the screen. I'm actually tempted to make or at least endorse some of the statements made by the panel members Bijay, Kumar, Elizabeth, Monica, Nayana. But given the time constraint, I think I'll go straight into my presentation, and that will have some reflection of some of the comments of already made by the previous speakers. So, I wonder if you can see I can share my screen. Is my screen seen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll start my presentation.
But if you do that more as questions would be lovely. Thanks.
Sorry, Mirbhai?
If you do that as questions, it would be lovely because then it will stimulate the next session.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. I'll basically pick two issues: public health system and migration in my presentation, and very much, reflecting on Bangladesh experience. Again, presentation from. Okay, so I mean, one of the achievements, if you may call it, is that response process to COVID-19 disaster has exposed a number of serious policy and administrative flaws in the entire health system in Bangladesh. It unveils the problems linked to a highly centralized system with limited accountability and chronic inadequacy of many kinds. For example, the lack of resources. Government had not always been keen on its spending on the health. According to WHO, a country is required to spend about 5% of its GDP, but we have we have actually less than 1% in the expenditure of $88 is the lowest in South Asia. And now this brings us to this this issue statement made by Bijay Kumar that planning and policy process has not been not integrated the investment planning properly, and health was probably seen as not a kind of a usual disaster events that a country like Bangladesh experiences, flooding, cyclone, or hazards like those. So it basically Bangladesh was caught completely unprepared uh, in in responding to the pandemic situation. And one of the other things that was exposed was the over dependence on commercial private sector health providing system, which turned out to be not only exploitative, inadequate, and completely without any control. I mean, one one report says that most hospitals and clinics in Dhaka and Chittagong, the two big cities, are unregistered, and government has very little control over them. And there has been a big court case going on right now for one of the private hospitals which was offering testing services for COVID-19, was basically printing out false reports, negative or positive, as they chose. So that was one of the. Then there was an acute shortage of hospital beds in the beginning, and many people were unable to offer, avail services from the clinics and hospitals. But it turned out that when over 15,000 hospital beds were set up in different cities in the country, people by then have developed an apathy or lack of interest in visiting hospitals. So now, in over 5 months' time, the hospital beds in most hospitals are seen empty because, lack of trust and also the concern about high cost and and spurious services have uh, got people away from availing these services. Although the corona cases are on the rise, 288,000 so far, and cases detected, and 3,800 deaths as of today. A couple of pictures showing, attitude and behavior of people during the pandemic time. Public awareness is very mixed. Some people are aware, and some, um, despite many what do you call propaganda, despite many orientations and advertisement, people's behavior towards confronting the pandemic is not been even or or positive. Now, coming to a migration issue, divided is an internal and external. Interesting finding was that um, although the urban migration from rural to urban migration was very high, 6% per year, but during following the pandemic, we have experienced a reverse migration. About 16% of Dhaka population was found to have returned to village homes because of lack of income and high cost of living in Dhaka. Um, and the the situation has resulted into a sudden increase in the poverty situation. Some of the recent studies have found. Bangladesh, over 2 decades of hard work, was successful in bringing down the people living under poverty line to 21% in the beginning of 2020. But in 5 months' time, it seems that it has shot up to 43% now. And we don't know what will be how much effort and time will we require to return to the previous situation. And during this pandemic, this period from March to August, we have experienced two major disaster situations. One was the Amphan, the cyclone Amphan, but more serious is the ongoing flooding of the country, which has been quite prolonged, and people worry that it will exacerbate the poverty situation. However, one change that we notice now, that the government's ability and and possession of resources in the hands of the government has enabled them to undertake massive social safety net and other assistance programs to overcome the problem. Uh, but results are yet to be seen, because again, the governance of the management of the programs have raised many questions about pilferage and theft and embezzlement of funds and all those. The social safety net measures have been effective to some extent, because we do not have reports of any serious hunger or malnutrition issues. Now, about external migration, regarding external migration, this interestingly became one of the areas of economy which was shining. About 10 million people were sending about 18 billion US dollar during this period. In May, in June this year, it brought about 18 million. It was rising from 15 billion in May to 18 billion in June this year. That was an interesting finding of one of the studies. In August, the travel restrictions were somewhat eased, which made thousands of people who had returned previously from abroad are rushing to get an air ticket and return to their place of work. One IOM study, however, says that 99% of the potential migrants who were interviewed would like to stay in the country if there were better job opportunities, income earning opportunities here. But the key drivers of migration for them were reportedly lack of security within the country and lack of employment. This picture shows that group of people just managed to get hold of their passports and tickets and were keen to go abroad. This is a makeshift camp. This picture shows the trickling in of Rohingya refugees. Although this is not an urban issue, but it is linked with the urban slum situation. Just this week actually, a study by BRAC's Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics and ICDDRB showed that 9% of urban population has contracted the virus, and interestingly, the incidence of cases were lower at among the slum dwellers and people living in the camp. Although Bijay Kumar said that cities are not inclusive, but behavior of pandemic has been quite discriminatory, positively perhaps for the poorer people living in the slums. So that's it, my presentation.
Thank you, Taher bhai. This whole one is this cascading effect of disaster over a disaster, being a refugee and then being, having coronavirus and then having cyclone, sort of disaster after disaster. This cascading effect is something that cities need to be prepared for. Let's go back to the panel again, and I have shared the questions, and if you have more questions, participants, please put them on the Q&A, and I'm sharing as they come. So the next round we will start, and we will start with, again, Bijay Kumar, with you. And I've shared some of the questions, so if you could integrate them addressing in your presentation in terms of what are the achievements that, that we've talked about. Now, what are the opportunities that you see? So in terms of opportunities, if any of the things that we've talked about, if you would do that, that would be really good. One good question was that, should we go back to normal at all? And that's something from the civil society point of view, if you would address. Thank you. Please go ahead.
So thanks, Mihir bhai. I'll try my best to see if I can address some of the questions. I'll try. Yeah. Can you see my presentation, by the way?
We can see your presentation. Actually, we can't hear you. If you come closer to the mic.
Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, yes. The civil society voice is a bit weak.
So that is what we will be actually challenging anyway.
Yes.
So can you see my presentation, by the way? But I'm not seeing
No.
that. No, okay.
No, but you can
No.
speak. I don't think we need presentation necessarily if you make the
Okay.
points in any case.
Okay. So let's
And
say
maybe
what.
that would be fine.
Okay. So what I'm talking of, that crisis, any crisis is a huge opportunity for change. We should take that into account. Now we don't have to have hazards becoming a disaster. This pandemic could have been prevented, prevented as a disaster. It can be, and it could have been prevented. The multiple hazards becoming a host of disaster now, each of that could have been prevented. So that is what, in my understanding, is an opportunity for us. Now, what perhaps one of the things, this is an opportunity to look at how we are planning a economic model or development model which is not perpetuating inequality, but perhaps redistributing the capitalism, if there is any term which is redistributed capitalism. But we need to see how the perspective and the benefits for the communities most at risk is taken on board. Now, the other thing, we need to see how can we actually do an all society approach. So all society approach is currently, we saw that being missing. So we think that perhaps there is a need to see if we want to live in a world which has the ability to prevent hazards becoming disaster, then we need to be together. That's the only way that we can do that. And that togetherness, as Mirvai you said, can be and easily be and will be facilitated by the civil society organization. They are better placed to do that. And in the process, make the structure, make the government accountable. So that accountability is critical. Some of the questions that you actually gave it to me is like, say, is the question, first question is, are we talking of inequality? Like what Soumya asked, inequality, is it only the poor people or slum dwellers? No, we have to actually look at inequality in that context. And we need to talk of what Srinivas is asking, walled cities. It depends on what the context that we are talking of. We'll come to that in a minute. And perhaps what is being talked of as the progress. Now the point is that from whose perspective that we are looking at the progress. So at each and every point that we need to keep in mind that the progress that we are looking at is from the perspective of the most vulnerable communities, is from the perspective of the people who are impacted the most. Now, end of the day, I would like to say that this is an opportunity to become more greener in terms of our approach and in terms of pursuing the development. What I see as the cities with a difference, some of the recommendations, some of the thinking that was coming to my mind. One, so can we actually look at a comprehensive anticipation or early warning system being put in place, which is comprehensive, and that analyzes the risk from the perspective of the communities who are most vulnerable. Can we actually make a plan which is relevant, which is context specific, and which is inclusive? And those plans need to absolutely put forward that what we are talking of in terms of leaving no one behind, and actually trying to see all those people who are currently experiencing the worst heat of any disaster for that matter in this pandemic are taking the leadership in the whole process. And how can we actually see that effective and collaborative response mechanism is put in place and which takes into account the psychosocial angle of the intervention. So this COVID-19 also told us that there's so much of psychosocial angle to the disaster that we must take into account in time to come. And we need to actually put in place a build back better approach, which is coherent. So we need to start with a urban planning, which is informing the climate action plans, which is informing the disaster risk reduction plans, which is informing sustainable development plans, which informs everything that we are talking of. And localization is the tool to actually take it forward. We realize that it is essential to see how the local actor's perspective is taking the decision in actually pushing it forward. And that local actor perspective includes the private sector, the local authorities, and most importantly, the civil society organizations representing the voice of the people who are most at risk, and they take a decision, and those decisions are linked to the international or the global discourse. So we're not talking of a localization which is an independent republic by itself, but we are talking of localization which are linked globally and which is in an iterative process linked to national as well as a global process. So we are part of a global village. So we are talking of a localization process. So where we link local to the global processes, but decisions are taken at the local level, and the governance is made accountable at the local level. End of the day, I just would like to share the only one thing that, the two things that I would like to say. One, risk analysis must inform anything and everything that we are doing in urban context or rural context. Second, I would say that it is essential localization is the way forward. These are the two critical things. And I would continue to say this. And in doing so, the civil society organizations have a critical role to play. That's all we are talking of as global network. And we are talking of three goals which strengthen the collaboration of the civil society organizations, which champion the localization and strive for a risk-informed development. And is so critical in the current context that we are talking of reimagining the world that we want to see, which prevents a hazard becoming a disaster. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bijay Kumar. You've addressed at least 3 of the 6 questions that were addressed to you, and also you've given good examples of possible opportunities in terms of localization and in terms of risk-informed investment, which anyway people agree to. And no need to go back exactly where we were. Maybe we should end up somewhere else. What I was discussing with somebody else yesterday, this was a global humanitarian studies related discussion. And one of the things which came up was rather telling about what's happening during this pandemic is that the pandemic is being localized and profits are being globalized. And I thought it was a passing remark, but I keep on thinking about it, that pandemic being localized and profits being globalized. Elizabeth, if you would kindly both address the questions, some of them quite directly, as well as show us the opportunities that you see are ahead of us. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and we can see beautiful designs.
Okay, well, you wanted some provocative designs, so I wanted to address a few things. So first of all, one of the questions that guides our work and that I think we have to really focus on going forward is this question of who is the public. Because I can tell you that in design school, what you most frequently see when people use this generic term, at least in my end of the world, is white, middle class or upper middle class with a lot of extra money, a lot of extra property and resources, and a lot of extra time. And that is, as we all know, that's not the majority of the public. So I think there are some definitions that need to be clarified to go forward. I also think there's a certain danger in focusing on the pandemic. The pandemic is only a symptom. The problem, there are systemic problems that have to be addressed. Will the pandemic change the city? It could. In 14th century Cairo, the pandemic, the Black Death, had a huge impact on urban form, where individual homes and neighborhoods had to become more self-sufficient. They had to have their own water supply, their own food supply, their own energy supply. And so they were networked together in much the way that we're promoting now through this idea of a mesh urbanism. So it could have an impact. I think the bigger impact is the global environmental crisis. And we have to change the way we think about our cities. the rural versus the urban is no longer a real distinction. Our cities only operate by being critically tied to the resources and the labor of the rural. They are one system, and we have to see it that way, but we have to change the scale at which this integration happens. And the other thing I I lost that train of thought. Sorry, I'll come back to that. But the physical changes to the city, we need to start thinking in smaller and smaller units. We need to start thinking in terms of closed loop systems. We have to, it's not that every neighborhood is a standalone fiefdom. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about local responsibility. I am talking about local decision-making power. A lot of the places I've worked have had corrupt or centralized governments that had too much power. What we're doing right now in Sri Lanka, and a lot of our work doesn't happen at the urban planning scale. We actually build a great deal. We actually have started schools and on and on and on. And we work a lot with women's empowerment and women's voice. But what we're doing now is we're designing a prototypical community in the undeveloped post-conflict parts of Sri Lanka where the focus is on being off the grid, partly because there is no grid. So what we're looking at is how can a community develop their own resources, manage their own resources, sell that knowledge as assets, and build a whole cycle that's about social empowerment, economic empowerment, and environmental and social health. And I need to stop. So I'm just going to show two images from, again, recent thesis work. This was one student who was looking at the downtown of Providence and saying, how can the downtown of Providence be a totally self-sufficient if need be, but critically linked to the bigger metropolitan and rural area system? And how can a dense urban center actually be fully integrated with the mechanisms for this sustainable wastewater, energy, food infrastructure? And then the other one was looking at Detroit, where she said, okay, Detroit we know is the prime example of a shrinking city. The people that are left are all living in pretty much in dire poverty. The attempts to revitalize Detroit have gone between teaching people how to grow their own food to revitalizing the downtown for conferences and, again, a high-end community. She said, okay, Detroit, the city of the automobile, is interlaced with transportation networks that are now largely dysfunctional. And so rather than just accept them as rotting infrastructure, how can we flip the city and begin to see that infrastructure as the heart of a new city, where all these scattered remnants of lower income communities are tied into that network as the center of jobs focused on food production, where Detroit goes from being a car manufacturing city to Detroit becoming one of the food hubs of America and Canada, because it also is right on the Canadian border. So, and then the last thesis project I just wanted to quickly show was in Manila, where another question that was asked was, you know, how do we serve the poor? I think, or how do we recognize the informal part of the city as something other than, you know, a community that maybe is sitting on land of higher value that needs to be moved and is put into high-rise slums, which do nothing to help that community and do nothing to help the community at large. She said, again, building off of our work, why can't, as we rebuild the mangrove swamps that are that used to protect places like Manila from devastating cyclones, how do we begin to accept the slums in their current location as critical players in this process? And how do we let them upgrade the slums in a way that's meaningful in exchange for their being part of the job force that actually makes the ecological side of the city function fully. And so again, this weaving together, looking at the historic arrangement in South Asia, which is distinctly different from the Americas, of low-income communities being scattered among middle-class and upper-class communities, and saying that's a healthy arrangement. How do we make it function better, where everybody is serving everybody else as well as themselves, and everybody is seen as essential to the overall structure and working performance of the city. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. And you know, one of the things that Duryog Nivaran is always keen is about alternative ideas. And you've given an idea of a city which is circular in terms of economy, city which is nurturing in terms of social protection. You and your students have given an idea about carbon fixing cities vis-a-vis carbon causing cities, and also informal cities. Why cities must be formal and structured? Can they be loosely structured or hardly structured at all? And can we have that kind of more? So it's very much a design approach to sort of alternative design approach that you are suggesting. Thank you so much. And Monica, if you would tell us about what are the opportunities, both in terms of design solutions, as we just heard, but also anything else you would like. And after that, we will have Nayana, please. Thank you, Monica.
Yes, so I'd like to share again some aspects already Elizabeth has discussed, that I was working on this very small scale of a street, of a neighborhood, and I'd like to still go through what the study of the street brought out to me, and understanding how we could build up a community or an area. And what I would like to share is that as we worked on Park Street and its many institutions like the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, ETH Basel, Switzerland, students from Loreto, Xavier's, Jadavpur University, they joined with Spark and they conducted detailed studies on the street. Now, so the results of these studies revealed that, contrary to popular belief, the maximum users of the street, they were not diners. They were students. And so we were actually not working towards our target population. The land use pattern of this area had altered over the years. And this is the importance of study in an area, that it tells us what's wrong with the area. So a large number of academic institutes like the Xavier's University, Loreto, Assembly of God Church School, the Park English School, APJ School, Jewish Girls School, Harrow Hall, and the many coaching centers which had grown, and they had totally altered the area. So we needed the youth to reclaim the street for the success of this project. We started rebranding Park Street as Knowledge Street, as a cultural destination. We devised some heritage walks, college heritage fests, school quizzes, history hunts, vintage rides, and the aim was to build, to inculcate a sense of pride and a sense of place within the younger generation. Now the studies, they also revealed that the demography of the area had changed. Communities like the Jews, Armenians, Parsis, Anglo-Indians that once claimed the area had long left. So Kolkata was at one time one of the 6 centers for Jews in the world. And now there are just 20 left, all over 80. So building inclusiveness was the aim of the activities that we organized, like a food fest, celebrating the legacy of the cuisines, and also involving these communities. Now, besides food, music was the other pulse of Park Street. It's the birthplace of jazz in India and the launchpad of many maestros like Louis Banks and Usha Uttar. So involving both young singers and the senior masters in a bilingual Bengali English street anthem. It succeeded in bridging a language as well as a generation divide. So there is a huge language divide also in the city and in an area where there are people who have access to education in English and people who don't, and it creates a divisiveness in the society. So meanwhile, Park Street, they started feeling the benefits. So heritage buildings like the Park Mansions, they were restored to their stately elegance. Some high street brands like Apple, Starbucks, they started making their appearance here, establishing that the street was reclaiming its place amongst the city and the youth. Even the much neglected South Park Street Cemetery, they invited us to give an outline proposal for a small open air theater to host a light and sound show inside the burial ground. And this was never built, luckily, because this place has a reputation for being one of the city's most haunted spots. And the audience may well have to be shifted to the many hospitals around. What did happen was the restoration of the tombs, the inscriptions, and the pathways. And our effort to rebrand the street as Knowledge Street, it also seemed fulfilled as Park Street became the stage for the Kolkata Literary Festival since 2019. And now during this pandemic, this Knowledge Street, it took on a totally new dimension as the network which had established over the years, it transpired into a community support system. The restaurants, like you can see this, I can see my friends from Oasis, from Kusum Rolls, many restaurants, they put their kitchens together. They came together to provide food for the needy, and through the helplines which had been created by these school and college alumni associations. So the street, it moved beyond being a physical entity to an entity, to a support system which was moving from the main city to the suburbs and beyond and providing a helpline. In fact, even the effects of the devastating cyclone Amphan, which hit the city, it felt milder because as the disaster mitigation teams worked through the street, they were joined with these neighborhood who had come in to restore normalcy to the area at the earliest. And while this festival may never witness that 50K, 100K audience again, what it has certainly achieved is to fill the cracks of the urban system with a resin of community support. It has helped to build resilience and I think an adaptability in the system so that even this virtual systems, it can adapt to much more easily. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are very, very good in terms of bringing in youth to relook at the city from resilience point of view, and also small acts of kindness, small acts of bringing knowledge together and how it adds up to the next level of resilience at a city level. We have Nayana, and I've distributed some of the questions already. So if you could address that, as well as tell us more importantly about the prominent opportunities that you see from Colombo perspective, but also for all of us in other large cities and from private sector as well. And
Sure.
after that, we'll go to Animesh Kumar for summing up. Thank you. Thank you,
Sure.
Nayana.
Thanks, Mihir. So there were a couple of questions about, do we want the pendulum to swing back? Should we not embrace the positives that we got out of, the recent events, maybe less traffic, cleaner air, and so on, at least in the city of Colombo? And how should that impact how we plan for the future? So, again, if you unbundle that a little bit and try to say, look, what are the positives and what are the key lessons that kind of come out of the, say, past 6 months that could help and should help inform how we think about planning our cities going forward? I would kind of take it on a couple of levels. First, I think the first thing that we need to think about is the technology actually helps. And technology enables things that we didn't really expect them to enable. So not big tech, but kind of small tech in the hands of communities, in the hands of community supply chains really makes a huge difference. And we're not talking massive technological leaps. We're talking people having a cell phone and being able to have localized communication networks set up. I think that's a really interesting thing that would not have been possible 10 years ago, and it's transformative. And the question is, what do we take from that to continue to push and continue to try to help smaller communities? The second thing that to me really came out is community actually matters. It's really these community networks that helped lots of people prevail and get through very severe lockdowns. And that's something, at least in a city like Colombo, that's that's struggling with this kind of what it means to be a modern city, and lots of slum clearance and moving people into high rises, which is extremely controversial. The underlying thing here is how important are these social networks, and when you break these social networks and put them into vertical housing, how does that change? It probably isn't positive, but again, understanding community and really embracing these social networks and planning around them, I think, is something that we really need to take on board. The third thing that's important to me as a lesson, again, pushing forward, is look, understanding that work can change. It might not change as radically as we expect it to, and it certainly won't change for everybody. But I think, again, being locked down for 3 months straight has shown that people's work habits and work processes actually can change. It swung all the way. It might not come exactly back to where it was, but again, it shows that there is room for adaptation, and that goes hand in hand with technology adoption as well. The fourth big thing that comes out to me is that community spaces are actually important. Big urban spaces are actually important. And the more we go into higher density, the more these urban spaces, outdoor spaces become important. And you see that in the resurgence. So again, as part of kind of looking at how you'd want to plan projects and investments and even cities in the future, the importance of urban space doesn't diminish, it perhaps increases in terms of places to kind of breathe and be. And the fifth thing to me, that lesson really is density has its positives. Hyperdensity perhaps has negatives, but when you look at a situation like Colombo, density has substantial positives, and if we really harness those, well-organized density has the ability to be very, very resilient and much more efficient to service and keep going. So density, again, is positive. So these are 5 things to me that come out as lessons that we should really think about in planning any kind of, whether it's an investment or whether it's a city as a whole. These are core principles. There's one thing that troubles me, though, and I don't have an answer. A city like Colombo struggles with adopting, if you will, mass transit in a huge way. We don't have a metro. We have a rail, which is British era and sluggish, and a very small percentage of transport goes on it. And we have a diminishing share of public transport in terms of overall trips. Now, in the last few months, people have kind of, there was a big push to move into mass transit, but over the last few months, people have kind of reverted back to private transport in a much more significant way. We don't feel it in terms of traffic because people are not fully back to work, but it's inevitable. And the question to me is, after a shock like we've had in the last few months, what happens to the public transport debate in emerging countries like Sri Lanka? And how do you make mass transit safe? Is a kind of pressing question. So I worry about that. I know, at least my own studies suggest that we will definitely go back to it, and we need to, but it will have an impact on the public debate around mass transit, and that's, I think, a worry to me in the context of Colombo.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nayana. Thank you so much for both raising some of the possible 5 areas where we can do marginal and to an extent substantial changes, such as technology, and sort of turn them into something which are convivial technology, the small useful tools, for example. And also this idea of moving density from hyper to hypo, and how that sort of shift is going to help us perhaps manage already large cities we have. We don't know yet, it needs to be explored, but definitely that's something that needs to address. And the transportation part, that mass transit for large number of people, that must need to be addressed. We'll go to Achyut Bhai, who's there with us from Practical Action, and he's worked with in Kathmandu. And if you would tell us, Achyut Bhai, in terms of what are the range of questions that come to your mind, as well as opportunities that come to your mind. Meanwhile, I'm suggesting Ray Bhai, you and all the others, to post your questions, as many as you can, during next 2 or 3 minutes, so that, and I'm allocating them to the participants. So we'll just have a quick round of questions after Animesh Kumar has been able to help us put things together. That way we will go slightly beyond time, but not too many minutes to do that. So Animesh Kumar, if that's all right, after Achyut Bhai, we'll go to you. And then if there was anybody who wanted to ask specific questions, and if not, obviously each of you will get a list of questions that are there on the list. And if there was something you wanted to pick up on that, and we do want to end 7, maybe sort of Indian 7, which is somewhere around Indian 5 as we started. But Achyut Bhai, please, thank you.
Thank you, Mihir Bhai, for having me in this very important webinar, having very prominent speakers like Bijay Bhai, Elizabeth, Nayana, and our own Monica. So I think this was really very, very encouraging. As you have asked me to share some of the experiences from Practical Action's point of view, we work according to our change ambitions. So that is trying to put ingenious ideas to work so people in poverty can change their world. So we are more interested about the broader environment as well as the poor people. So we try to help people to find solutions to some of the very challenging problems because the catastrophic climate change or the gender inequality. So these are some of the things. So according to this topic, the 2 things that is very close to our heart, Practical Action's heart, that is basically for people who are in urban slums and who belong to low-income communities. So how we can make the cities in poorer countries cleaner, healthier, and places to live and work. So that is our ambition. Likewise, again, for the people threatened by climate and natural hazards, we try to build disaster resilience into the lives of people. They are threatened by hazards. Then we try to reduce the risk of hazards so that the impact on lives and livelihoods can be minimized. So we try to help communities to become more resilient. So to do this, Practical Action's approach is understanding the system. Like the previous speaker said, how we can consider the cities into small system, then trying to understand the system and understand what are the gaps, where are the blockages, and gradually work on those blockages so that the system again, starts working. So that is one of my takeaway that very much resonates with Practical Action's work. Likewise, how we can bring the risk element into broader development planning. So that is very, very fundamental to the whole development paradigm now, because all the kind of floods, even with less than 10 centimeter rainfall over 24 hours, our cities are all flooded. So I think that needs to be considered, because we are all developing nations, and the urbanization that is unplanned, that is more haphazard. So many people, mainly from the rural areas, they come for the opportunities, how we can find employment, how we can make our lives better, how we can educate our children. So how we reverse the trend. I quite agree with personal views of Nayana, because perhaps we may not be able to reverse the trend, but at least we can make some improvements. If there are more improvements, for instance, if the villages or even the smaller towns are livable, having a lot of opportunities, then gradually people will stop moving into the cities. I have seen some of very important trends. Most of the migrant workers, they are trying to come back home. Mainly, I'm talking about Nepal, and they want some kind of access to finance so that they can start up some business. They want to get back into agriculture if they are provided some technology or some inputs, so that it is less. The agriculture is having less drudgery and more rewarding. So if we can change those kind of situations, then obviously the cities transferring into metropolitan cities, that trend can be somehow delayed, although we may not be able to stop. Another my takeaway is, making more investments in the villages and the small towns, so that the bigger cities are not further, urbanized, and the slum areas are somehow controlled. Because the pandemic, we have seen most of the hotspots are the slum areas, most of the vulnerables are all these poor people. The spread has taken place from there, more deaths are there. So how we can, although cannot reverse the trend, how we can minimize these. So that is another takeaway. Then, based on some of my own observation, wherever we have accountable government, the accountable local government, then it is much better controlled. For example, if it is not directly centralized, if adequate power is given to the local authorities, if they have some resources, then they are really after it, and they have been able to, stop some of the trends. And there are few questions, mainly, okay, how it is impacting the climate. Obviously, after 2 decades, I am seeing a very blue sky in Kathmandu, like in Europe or in the US. Otherwise, it was always a brown sky. So obviously, there are some positives, mainly from climate change point of view. Again, when the lockdown was eased, mainly in Kashmir, Nepal, then I could see that people were not traveling unnecessarily. So they were really scared, and they thought that if there are no urgent tasks that I need to really travel, then they were not traveling and they were staying at home. So that is obviously, we need to consider. And Monica shared some very, exciting stories, how the Park Street has been again transformed into a kind of cultural, cultural street, like in the past. So these are very good stories. So how we can, convert these kind of stories in other towns also, so that we have more open space, and during the time of disasters, at least people have, places to go. If I talk about Nepal, it is obviously earthquake, it is obviously about, floods. So I think that we need to consider. So during the Corona time, I think there are 3 things, as I understand. If the government were, any government was able to, limit the spread by, as Nayana said, imposing very strict lockdown, that was very useful. If it was not, disciplined, then obviously, the spread was not much controlled. Then the second point is, we're talking about the supply chain. So we need to make sure that how the essentials are, provided to the citizens, so that, they can be confident to remain at home, they can go to the nearby shops, they can stop going to the bigger malls. So I think that will also help the small shopkeepers again to revive. Otherwise, in the big towns, all the businesses of the small towns are being taken away by the big malls. So I think that means again, that will be helping to the circular economy. And the third, I think we need to work more on recovery, which should be resilient. It is not about just recovery, but how we can make it resilient. So I think we need to think more on that. And I think these would be some of the recommendations from my point of view. And I really enjoyed hearing the prominent speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Achyut bhai. That's very much, especially the whole issue of inequality that you talked about, and also cities and floods that cities are facing. Let's go to Animesh Kumar with UNDRR, and as he himself has proclaimed that he is the prompter to the DRR journey that all of us are taking in Asia Pacific. So anybody who misses the line or the direction or the phrase, there he is, always behind. But here he has agreed with great trouble to be on the scene. So please prompt us in terms of what are the opportunities that we have to move ahead, having heard both the achievements so far and second round of opportunities that various panelists have actually mentioned. So we'll have Animesh Kumar, and after that, if I have already circulated the questions to the panel members. So if there is a panel member who wishes, like Nayana does, there is one question. There is one question you do want to respond publicly right now. Please think of that, select from the ones you've received, and that will be the last round. Yes, Animesh Kumar, please. Sorry, Animesh Kumar, please.
Thanks, Mihir bhai. It's very fascinating hearing all the interventions from the panelists. So what I would do, it's a slightly difficult task after hearing for 2 hours to bring things together under a risk management framework. But that's what exactly I'll try to do in the next 9 minutes or so. I'll try to start from where Krishna left, and also while responding, picking up some of the questions that the participants have raised. Very good questions actually in the chat box. We need to acknowledge that as of now, more number of people in the world live in the urban areas than in the rural areas. And in the next 30 years, 2/3 of the people in the world will live in the urban areas. So this dichotomy between the rural and the urban is at best cosmetic as of now. And as was very well pointed by several panelists, including Krishna, that we need to start moving towards a new thinking that while urbanization mirrors economic growth, we don't need to accentuate that. We need to move towards a world where we move on from the concept of expanding and unplanned urbanization, which is one of the biggest drivers of risk, towards providing urban services to the rural areas, what I often joke as moving from the concept of rural towns to urban villages. So this conceptual thinking is at the heart of whatever we are talking about. Now, coming back to the cities, I think the cities have a series of trade-offs, and I'll just point to 2 of them. One, in context of COVID, they are the hub of population in terms of density of population, and hence the spread of the contagion has been much higher than in the rural areas. But at the same time, they're also the centers of health infrastructure. Secondly, while the awareness level, the access to information and technology and communication channels is much higher in the urban areas, the social capital and the community aspects is not as high in the urban areas. So these are trade-offs, but as was pointed out by Monica actually, that there are some good examples where the community feeling and the social capital in the urban areas can also be accentuated. It's not inbuilt, but it can be cultivated. Now, beyond the topic of the discussion, if you look at the concept note, and WHO has come out with a 6-step process of opening up of economies and cities and so on, which are mostly health related. I'll try to concentrate on the socioeconomic aspects of COVID and how do we move forward from here towards a more resilient recovery process. I'll try to frame initially in drawing from the panelist intervention so far in terms of 5 challenges, and then a set of opportunities and recommendations that we need to take care of. The first challenge which I see in the context of COVID and vis-a-vis the local authorities and the cities is the declining fiscal space that most governments used to enjoy. I mean, IMF has already predicted that the financial crisis, the recession that the world is moving into, will be much worse than what we saw 12 years ago. The World Bank has just come out with data that around 100 million people could be pushed back into the poverty line because of the COVID. At the same time, the governments are rolling out huge economic stimulus to recover from COVID. All of it points to a declining fiscal space for the government, especially for the local authorities who are facing the dual challenge of declining revenues and increasing expenditure, which will have a larger impact on the expenditure on social areas, on economic investments into infrastructure investments, and the capital investments, which are so much necessary to fuel growth in the cities. So this is a kind of a challenge that COVID poses. And if you look at the recent UN report that we came out with by SCAP earlier this year, if you look at the SDG growth in Asia Pacific, we are not doing very well in Asia Pacific region on SDG progress. We are actually decelerating, regressing on several of the SDG targets in the country, which is not good news for us. The second challenge, which has come out so strongly from the COVID experience, is the importance of risk communication. We have so much strong access to information, and then that gets multiplier in impact because of social media. We can enter a phase of infodemic. And the challenge with this infodemic is that while the information is coming out, it's parallel with the growth of the virus. There's so much little known about the virus, but there is a volumes in information, some of which are true, some of which are not true, some of which we don't know. So, and then this messaging of the communication part is so important that if we don't have the right communication, it can lead to even bigger disaster than we are facing now. So that's the second challenge. The third, which has been pointed out by several panelists as well, is that the disasters induced by natural hazards, by technological hazards, they would not wait for the COVID to get over. They are happening, as has been seen in Cyclone Amphan in the Bay of Bengal, Nisarg in Arabian Sea, in Cyclone Wangfong in the Philippines, or Cyclone Harold in the Vanuatu region. Cyclones are happening. Other disasters are happening. If I just look at the disaster data, starting from the time when COVID started in Asia Pacific to date of, say, end of July, we have faced an average of around 2 disasters per day in Asia Pacific, which has resulted in the death of around 65 persons per week, which has affected around 3.3 million people per month. And I'm not calculating the COVID impact in this. I'm just talking about the disasters which have resulted from natural hazards and the technological hazards. Now, the compounded impact of these natural hazard and technological hazard induced disaster with COVID is even more disastrous situation, which humanity has never faced in the past. So we are leading into a world where we have to change our SOPs. The disaster managers have to look at a phase where preparedness itself is being challenged because of the COVID situation. We saw in Bangladesh and Odisha states and in West Bengal how the response to Cyclone Amphan was so much impacted simply because the SOPs had to be changed. The number of people who could be put in cyclone shelters had to be reduced because of the social distancing measures. So everything has to be taken into account while the disasters keep happening. And as Elizabeth also pointed, that these risks are not isolated. They are not working in silos. They are systemic in nature. One risk will lead to something else, and COVID is just a symptom, as she pointed out. It's not something which is an event. It's a symptom of the way society is progressing, and it has just come out, multiple things have come out together to cause a systemic failure. So the systemic risk management is something which is so important as of now. Now, you, Mihir, in the beginning itself, I'm moving to the fourth challenge, pointed to the impact on the small businesses, the micro, small, and medium enterprises. And if I add the element of informality to it, it becomes even more challenging for the people who own small businesses. If I look at a recent OECD report, 60% of businesses in Nepal, 40% in New Zealand, 50% in Thailand are all going to close down or have already closed down because of COVID. This is an impact which is impacting one of the most vulnerable sections of the society. And unfortunately, small businesses don't have access to the kind of protection mechanisms that the governments often offer. And even if they have contingency planning, even if they have business continuity planning, we saw in a recent survey in the Philippines that the health hazards normally don't get reflected in the risk registers of most corporations. So they have operational risks, they have natural hazard risks, but they don't have health hazards. But that's a big challenge for the private sector that, again, they need to take into account. And that's a lesson that we have learned. And finally, as Mr. Achyut also pointed and other panelists as well, the issue of migration. The mass exodus that we saw from the urban areas to the rural areas, a lot of distress migration, not only carried the virus from the urban areas to the rural areas, but also moved the virus from a place where we have health infrastructure to places where we don't have enough health infrastructure. This became a kind of a cyclical process, which is now becoming a challenge. But at the same time, the cities are now facing challenge of restarting the work, the service delivery, the construction process. Everything is stalled because we just don't have the workers. How do these workers get back to the cities? So the migration process itself was a huge challenge. Now, if I move forward from the challenges that I pointed out to some of the opportunities that have come out very strongly as well, and moving towards the positive side of it. One is very clear, we need to invest in disaster risk governance. As has been seen in India and Maldives and Vanuatu, the disaster risk management institutional and policy mechanisms are being used to respond to COVID. So if we have an existing structure, it makes sense to use it for multiple purposes. The second opportunity we have is in context of, and that Taher Saab was mentioning in context of Bangladesh, is investment in social protection. The social protection mechanism in itself, one of the biggest acupressure points through which recovery process can be made a bit more smooth and streamlined. But there are two key challenges with the way social protection mechanisms are currently being implemented, which we need to revisit. The first, social protection mechanisms that the way they are being implemented are not very shock responsive. They continue to be implemented in the way they are, but the agility of a social protection mechanism in anticipation of a disaster like COVID or another crisis is not very strong. So we need to provide that level of shock responsiveness to social protection programs so that it can be scaled up for relief delivery, for response to a crisis like COVID, if we have a program existing which has this mechanism of shock responsiveness. The second component of a good social protection program is that it needs to be universal. We have this challenge of huge number of missing middle populations who are outside the ambit of poverty eradication program and are not part of any other programs. And we miss this huge missing middle set of population, which is a huge number in most of the countries in South Asia. That's a huge problem. And I think unless we make social protection programs universal, we will not be able to address this challenge. Countries are playing with the ideas of universal basic income, and it has been shown in multiple country studies that it does give right dividend. And when we link universal social protection with universal health coverage, in Thailand, where I am located, it's one of the good examples where Thailand did respond very well simply because we had a universal healthcare system here, which is linked to the social protection program, has been running for the last 15 years very well. And hence COVID response was just part of the process. The third opportunity, which actually has been raised by many participants, is in context of the green recovery process and was also raised by some of the panelists. In 2020, if we look at the impact of pandemic on the climate change levels, we have seen a reduction of CO2 gas emissions by around 8% from 2019 to 2020. This is a huge opportunity. We will lose this opportunity if we get back to the normal. And that points us to the reason why, Mr. Mihir, you were also mentioning earlier that we need to build back better. But this building back better also needs to be greener. We need to adopt the nature-based solutions. We need to adopt ecosystem-based, systems-based approaches. We need to go by the building with nature approaches to ensure that the recovery process is as green as possible. Participants have pointed out to the hazard of disposal of PPEs and masks, for example, which is itself becoming a challenge. That's just part of it, but we need to go beyond it. We need to look at the standardized designs. We need to look at the circular economy. And as was pointed out by some of the panelists as well, the radius of the value chain needs to be reduced in cities. And we need to become a bit more self-sufficient in the cities so that, for example, through urban food production and so on, we can ensure that the cities become a bit more self-sufficient and don't always depend on the value chains. So we need to go beyond building back better to greening back better. So that's the kind of a key message here. Finally, what are the key enablers of these opportunities to be implemented? First, we need to be innovative. It has come out with so many examples, especially in the second round of interventions from the panelists, that we need to be innovative. But when I say innovative, we need to go beyond technology. COVID has pointed out that technological innovation is good, but innovation in governance, innovation in institutions, innovations in economic systems are even more important. We need to share these good practices. The second enabler is that we need to go beyond government to governance. And that's what Bijay was mentioning so eloquently, that it's just not about the government's work, it's everyone's work. We need to engage citizenship. We need to engage the communities in the process that we follow. We need to ensure that the data that we get, the information we get is democratized. The citizen science engagement is so important. There's a fabulous group of people, a young scientists forum called You Inspire, which is coming up with such a good mechanism in several countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. That bridges the digital divide. Some of the participants have raised about it, that we're moving towards online education, but a section of population, a big section of population has no access to it. We need to talk about decentralization of the government process and gender inclusiveness. We need to have the data which is sex and age disaggregated. So these are some of the enablers in terms of the information process. Finally, we need a holistic approach. We cannot go city by city by city, opening up one by one. It will not work. It's a systemic problem and needs a systemic way of addressing it. We need to remember that nobody is safe till everyone is safe. So the cooperation among cities is so important. We cannot act on COVID response and opening up in a very siloed way. I will end with some quick information on what we can support on this process. Mihir Bhai, earlier you mentioned about the Making Cities Resilient campaign. We are launching the next generation City Resilient campaign after 10 years of work. So that will be running for the next 10 years. It's called MCR 2030. It will see a new series of tools being released. We already are implementing the scorecards, and one scorecard is based on health aspects of city, which is also being trained, and your organization and others are also part in it. We are launching the new version of Making Cities Resilient campaign on 24th in the month of October this year. And finally, many of the issues that this webinar has raised will be brought together in the form of the ministerial conference we are organizing. It was meant to, in another world, would have been organized by now in Brisbane, but now it will be a virtual conference most probably, and we'll be organizing in the first half of next year. So we'll try to see how the policy issues that have been raised in this webinar can be brought at the interministerial level so that the decision makers take a note of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Animesh Kumar. This was really a fantastic getting a whole range of presentation and perspectives together. And my video is not there. A whole range of, and also very succinct. So I thank you for that. And very forward-looking as well. So not only rethinking, but reacting, as I said before, what is it that we do differently as we move forward further. I have a question to the panel members here. We are very much out of time. So if you wish, you can answer one question, or I will close this after that. So Bijay Kumar, if you have any special wish, or should I pass on to Elizabeth? If you have any, or do you want to? Monica?
Oh, I wanted to thank Animesh. I think he summarized it incredibly well.
Thank you. Monica?
Yeah, I think Animesh has answered some of the questions which were addressed to me, but I really do want to add that what we have seen, the survival during this pandemic is of the smallest unit of society, which was of the family and the home. And most of the systems, the larger systems collapsed, but this was the system which survived. And if we build on it, we understand that we need to move from the micro to the macro and not the other way around for creating better systems. So.
Thank you. That's very.
If I may come.
Yeah, Bijay Kumar, if you want.
It's great listening to Animesh. Fantastic summary, Animesh. As always done. Brilliant. I just wanted to reiterate that end of the day, the systemic approach, systemic change that we are actually talking about, we have to keep in mind from whose perspective that we are actually talking about. Let's not lose track of the people who are most at risk, who are experiencing multiple denial of rights, who are the most vulnerable. That's the first part. Second, can we ensure that risk is an integral part of anything and everything that we do? So that's the only way we can protect ourselves in time to come. And number three, can we ensure that we work together as all society, where we recognize everybody has a role to play and civil society has a critical role to play. And let's start from local actors, local civil society that takes into account and are informed by the local realities and take a decision. But that decision, which is informed by the global discourse. So let's actually work together, and it is possible that we prevent hazards becoming disaster. It is a possibility if we work together. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to all of you. Thanks a lot. Great meeting all of you, by the way.
Thank you so much. Oh, there is. Mihir Saab, where is Mihir Saab? Bhatt ji, kahan gaye aap? Radhika, we have lost.
Yes, ma'am. I guess we have lost Mihir sir. He was asking all the panelists if they want to say something.
Yeah, anyone?
So maybe we can continue on.
Till he joins back.
Yeah, please, can we continue? If anyone wants to answer any question, please go ahead, take the mic.
Yeah.
Nayana sir, yes.
Yes, if I may, I think Animesh and Bijay summed it up pretty well. I would just add one thing. In looking at this, I think while we look at kind of government and policy level interventions and civil society interventions as well, I think we shouldn't forget that there's an important role for the private sector to play as well. And perhaps some of the best innovations can perhaps come from the private sector. The trick is, how do you get them mobilized? So maybe that's something worth looking at. There was a question about, look, how can tech and private sector kind of equalize and normalize kind of social exclusion, make sure that things are equalized. And again, I think the private sector has a somewhat unique ability, particularly on the technology front, to effectively anonymize kind of cultural, religious kind of bases and put everybody on an equal platform. So that's the only thing I would add. Thank you very much.
Achyut ji, आप कुछ बोलना चाहेंगे? Yeah, Mihir Saab is back. Yes, Mihir ji.
I'm so sorry. This was connection was lost totally. So Bijay Kumar, you were Nayana was there, and if he wanted, I suppose, yeah.
I just responded.
Okay, you did. Thank you, Nayana Kumar. So let's sum up. Kirtibai is here. So before that, I'd like to again thank all of you as panelists and the participants who stayed on all this time, obviously for your interest and your support. This was not possible. And my rethinking about cities that all of us have done today is starting with, how do we have cities which are equalizer for living, so it equalizes us for living? How do we have cities as a multicultural way of living? How do you have cities as informal, more informal way of living than the formalized that we are moving towards to? How do you have cities which are convivial in terms of tools and technology that we are using? And how do we have cities which are actually feminizing the way we do governance, the way we do nurturing, the way we do protection and preparedness? So the role of not only women themselves, but men as well in that, very actively turning cities more caring and more supportive to each other and to other cities as well. and also cities which are sort of more agile way of living that we can have, then very structured and very silos way of living, and also city very much as which Animesh put his finger in terms of, he said, sort of zero or sort of lesser supply. But if I may say so, that sort of cities which are within some sort of regional boundaries of 100 miles or so, and there is a concept called 100 miles living. And if that is something which could be applied to cities and see how that works out. So that's something I'm very much happy to take back. And what a marvelous, marvelous opportunity in INHAF. Thank you. And Duryog, Nivaran, thank you so much. Madhvi, Priyanti, Karen, Ramona, all of you, thank you so much for that. What a multidisciplinary understanding about city and risk, and interdisciplinary as well. Thank you very much. Kirtibai, thank you, and to you, please.
Thank you. Well, it's 7:30. This morning when I was talking to Mihir about conduct of this webinar, among many things we discussed, I told him, don't worry too much about time. If someone is making a good presentation, allow them to go ahead. I never thought he would misuse it so badly in terms of going till 7:30, but it was all worthwhile. Mihir bhai, thank you very much for such an informative, insightful, and a rounded kind of webinar. As everyone will agree with me, that within this 2.5 hours, we have filled up an enormous amount of information and insight and understanding in this meeting. I must thank each and every panelist, and I think I'm not going to worry about other half a minute that I take, and I'm going to name each one of you while thanking you. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Mahmood Saab. Thank you, Bijay Kumar. Thank you, Achyut bhai. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Nayana. Thank you, Animesh Kumar. And thank you, Krishna ji. Thank you very much. It has been remarkable in terms of what we have learned. Now, I don't think there is a scope for me to kind of say anything about the webinar itself, but let me just make a small little kind of a thing, and that is this, that COVID has given us an entirely different definition, entirely different dimension, identity, pehchan to the disaster, especially to the natural disaster. I was telling this to Mihir this morning, that no one ever thought that a country of 1,350 million people, 638,000 villages, 8,000 towns and cities, and nearly $3 trillion economy can get completely locked down for months together. Now, we have never really understood and thought about disaster in this particular manner. And this has essentially rubbed into dramatically in our psyche. And I think, and therefore, when it comes to, say, climate change, which is likely to be much bigger than what we have in terms of COVID, and it looks around the corner, will not be in a denial mode. I think because it's likely to be much bigger, much more demanding, and much more harmful. It's once again not only big disasters like COVID and even climate change, not only global and big, it's also local and even slightly smaller. Only yesterday, I was watching a TV show on what is happening to the city Gurgaon in Delhi. entire city has come to standstill because of heavy rain. Nothing is moving. And we have continuously learning about cities suffering from heavy rain, Mumbai, Chennai, Srinagar. And they're causing enormous amount of damage. They're causing enormous amount of disruption. And it's very important that we're prepared for all that. And this particular webinar has given us huge amount of thinking, huge amount of counsel to think about and prepare ourselves for. Now that is about this webinar. Let me come back to the overall webinar series. So let me request all of you who are present and who are still not left, that we badly need your feedback on the webinars we are conducting. Tell us what you like, tell us what you do not like, tell us what needs to improve, what needs to change. It must be done because these webinars are for you, and it's very important that you learn from it and you enjoy them. Then you'll be available when next webinar comes. And my last point is, let me tell you that the next webinar, which is 13th in the series, will take place on 26th of August at 6 o'clock in the evening, and it is on collaborative governance. The question that is being asked is collaborative governance the solution? And it's going to be anchored by Dr. Anjali Mohan, the urban planner, and it has an international panel which is going to debate the multiple dimensions of urban governance issues. Please be available, please come, and until then, thank you very much for the panel once again. Mihir, thank you very much for this remarkably rich webinar that you conducted. In fact, I just wanted to kind of suggest whether we could have one more sometime in October. I hope you will not say no. It was remarkable for its depth, it's remarkable for its wisdom and what we got out of this. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Kirtibai, in fact, we are thinking as Duryog Nivaran, a next webinar on early warning system. The date is not decided yet, but the work is on, and we'll be in touch on that. Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone for being here, being kind, and being so, sharing so much and so well.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you,
everybody.
Mihir. Thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.
Nayana,
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
And we'll be in touch.